In 1942, Adolf Hitler was the master of Europe. The Nazi empire he had created stretched from the steppes of Russia to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Hitler predicted that the conquests carved out by his armed forces would last for 1,000 years. Millions had been enslaved by the Nazis, condemned to be worked to death for the glory of the Third Reich. German satellites like Romania were to sacrifice their fighting men in the Nazi cause. They were dispensable units in Hitler's war machine. But the war Hitler started came home to Germany with a vengeance. The Third Reich lasted not 1,000 years, but a mere 12, and ended in ruins. And it was amid the wreckage of Hitler's empire that the victorious Allies were confronted with stark evidence of another aspect of Nazi rule: the systematic plunder of the wealth of occupied Europe. Not only the gold reserves accumulated by defeated nations and used by Germany to underwrite its war effort, but also the pathetic possessions of those the Nazis had murdered in the extermination camps, their rings and gold fillings, their spectacles, clocks, and watches. Behind this barbarism lay another story of looting: the systematic theft of Europe's art treasures. This priceless heritage became the plaything of Hitler and his henchmen. In 1945, amid a sea of human suffering, it was the job of special Allied teams to recover this booty and restore it to its rightful owners. In Italy, which had been raked from top to bottom with fierce fighting, the great collection of the Medicis was returned to the Uffizi Palace in Florence. This restoration of part of Florence's medieval and Renaissance glory represented only a fraction of the massive task undertaken by the Allied art hunters. But the process of restitution, begun in the shadow of the century's most terrible conflict, continues to this day. Over 50 years after the end of the Second World War, the legacy of Nazi looting is still with us. In the sale room of an international auction house in Vienna, works of art stolen by the Nazis are sold in aid of victims of the Holocaust. There are many buyers, but a dwindling band of survivors to benefit from these acts of charity. The evil that men do lives after them. Adolf Hitler was a military amateur, albeit a brilliant one, whose scorn for orthodoxy had led to sweeping victories in Western Europe, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. The Führer had little time for the military professionals who queried his every move. And it was the Führer who had been vindicated by events. The symbols of Nazism were everywhere, just as at Nuremberg. And the daily routines instilled into the young members of the Hitler Youth the same principles of order and coordination which governed the lives of their parents. The Nazis had marked their coming to power with an orgy of book burning. Onto the bonfires went thousands of banned books. It was not long before the Nazis brought other aspects of the arts under their control. Hans Feibusch was the kind of painter of whom the Nazis disapproved. He and his colleagues soon felt the sting of the Nazi whip when a mysterious artist, unknown to Feibusch, applied to join the group of painters of which he was a member. What followed was a brutal introduction to the policy of coordination.
This new member turned up in Nazi uniform. Boots and belt and the whole thing, riding crop. And when we were all seated round the table, he got up, jumped on the table, and started to harangue us. And with his riding crop, he pointed at the Jewish members, you and you and you and you. You can now just go home and forget about exhibition or anything. If you want to go on painting in your four walls, well, that's up to you. But you will not show any of your stuff in public anymore.
Adolf Hitler had no doubt about what he liked. The moose had nothing to fear from the Führer. Here was Nazi-sanctioned art in all its empty glory. Officially approved celebrations of honest toil, and the female form. In 1937, the Nazis staged an exhibition of the so-called degenerate art produced by painters like Hans Feibusch. Their aim was to demonstrate that this art was not merely new or odd, but a direct threat to the German way of life, to civilization itself. Many of the paintings in the exhibition were later sold at an auction in Zurich. But not before they had attracted massive crowds all over Germany. Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels rallied the German public behind him. It was an easy matter to play on the prejudices of ordinary Germans. The Jews, Goebbels claimed, were behind these excesses. Like the degenerate artists, the Jews could be isolated from the body of German society and subjected to an escalating program of persecution. The Nazis began by burning books. Now they were well down the road to burning human beings. Among the principal beneficiaries of this policy were Hitler's cronies, not least of them Hermann Göring, Deputy Führer and honorary huntmaster of the Third Reich. Göring grabbed his chance with both hands. His privileged position enabled him to fill his country estate with the kind of art he liked. Not only were the walls of Karinhal festooned with hunting trophies, its vast interiors were also filled with paintings, tapestries and sculptures acquired at knockdown prices by the Deputy Führer. Karinhal was a monument to Göring's taste and his acquisitiveness. Nazi plundering followed the swastika. In 1938, the independent state of Austria was absorbed into Nazi Germany. An immediate victim was Baron Louis de Rothschild. The Baron was imprisoned, and the Rothschild holdings, including the art collections, confiscated. Other Jewish collections suffered the same fate. Nearly the beginning. In the autumn of 1938, at Munich, Hitler secured agreement to the German occupation of the Czech Sudetenland. It was a bloodless conquest. In March 1939, Hitler swallowed up the rest of Czechoslovakia. Prague's ancient Radny Castle became the seat of German government and the venue for art exhibitions singing the praises of German labor. The die was cast. Over the chiseled Aryan images and bronzed bodies, the war clouds were gathering. Soon these soldiers would be fighting a real war rather than one on canvas. In August 1939, the British reluctantly prepared for war. Reservists were called up, and women and children evacuated from cities likely to be bombed by the Luftwaffe. Anti-aircraft guns appeared in public parks, the sandbags embellished by amateur artists. Great art collections like that housed in London's National Gallery were taken down from the walls and evacuated to secret locations far from the danger of German bombs. The trucks trundled westward to a slate mine in Wales. Similar scenes were being enacted across Europe. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The campaign lasted barely 6 weeks. Hitler took the salute at the Victory Parade in Warsaw. German-occupied Poland was turned over to the rule of a Governor-General, Hans Frank, who instituted a regime of the utmost brutality. Its declared aim was the subjugation of the Poles and the extracting of as much as possible of the country's resources for the benefit of Germany. The Jews in Warsaw were confined to a ghetto, behind whose walls tens of thousands starved to death. The ultimate destinations of the Jews in the ghetto were the death camps in eastern Poland. The possessions of both rich and poor fell into German hands. Since Germany no longer recognized Poland as a nation, the pillaging of its art collections went virtually unchecked. In the early summer of 1940, it was the turn of the Low Countries and France. The French army, long considered the most powerful in Europe, was swept aside. The French seemed as helpless as the Poles. France's roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the German onslaught. France's allies, the British, were evacuated from Dunkirk, along with thousands of French troops. On the 21st of June, the French signed surrender terms in the railway coach in which a German delegation had signed the armistice in November 1918. Hitler was exultant. A week earlier, the German army had entered Paris, which had been declared an open city. The swastika was raised over Paris's most famous landmark, the Eiffel Tower. At the end of the month, Hitler the Conqueror visited Paris as a tourist. His Mercedes cruised through the deserted French capital, while the Führer told his companions, among them Albert Speer, that he preferred Vienna. For the first and last time, Hitler gazed on the Eiffel Tower. He impressed his companions with his detailed knowledge of the layout of the opera. The conquered French made an accommodation with the Germans. The aged Marshal Pétain was to head a puppet government based in Vichy in the southern half of France, which had not been occupied by the Germans. His prime minister was Pierre Laval, and command of the Vichy French armed forces was vested in Admiral Darlan. But the fate of Vichy France rested entirely in the hands of Adolf Hitler. Much of France's artistic heritage was now stored in repositories in the occupied and unoccupied zones. It was soon to become the focus of a tug-of-war between the German army and the emissaries of the Nazi elite. But in Paris at least, there was time for the occupiers to enjoy themselves. The portly Goering quickly sank into the fleshpots. The Germans strove to maintain Paris as the jewel of occupied Europe. Under the direction of the German ambassador in Paris, the Francophile Otto Abetz, the Germans launched a charm offensive. And Parisian nightlife had its charms for German officers. In the summer of 1940, the German army had assumed that it was responsible for the cataloguing and safeguarding under the terms of the Hague Convention of the artistic patrimony of France. Punctiliously, historic buildings were placed off-limits to troops. The art historian officers of the Army's Monuments Protections Office were keen to do everything by the book, but there were competitors in the field. After the German reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, 2 art historians had been commissioned to secretly prepare a list of items removed by the French during the Napoleonic Wars. This was now expanded to include what Joseph Goebbels deemed 500 years of foreign plunder of German works of art. The army still stood guard over the art depositories, but the Louvre Museum in Paris began rapidly to fill with more accessible items, among them the confiscated collections of Jewish dealers and connoisseurs. Teams answerable only to Hitler had moved in to exploit the decision to strip citizenship from all French nationals who had fled France between the 10th of May and the 5th of June. The prospect of rich pickings beckoned. Meanwhile, as the German army began converting barges for a cross-channel invasion of England, the Germans were preparing lists of all the great British art holdings. To relieve the pressure on the Louvre, storage space was made available at the Jeu de Paume, the home of Impressionist painting. The curator of the Jeu de Paume was an heroic Frenchwoman, Rose Valland, who, in addition to being an art historian, was a member of the resistance. She was also the only senior member of staff with whom the Germans were prepared to work. Valland was to play a vital role in keeping track of the comings and goings of the paintings consigned to the Jeu de Paume. Meanwhile, the Germans were suffering their first setback of the war. In the Battle of Britain, Goering's Luftwaffe had failed to eliminate RAF Fighter Command. The British retained control of the air. The invasion, codenamed Sea Lion, was abandoned. The disappointed Hermann Goering cheered himself up on a spending spree at the Jeu de Paume. He was careful, however, to leave the choicest items for the Führer. As she was to do throughout the German occupation, the diligent Rose Valland carefully noted this activity. America was not yet at war with Germany, and New York offered a potentially lucrative market for German holdings of degenerate art. But the US Treasury blocked efforts to import them. Instead, they became part of a German internal market in which Impressionists were exchanged for the Renaissance masters the Nazis favored. Meanwhile, Pablo Picasso kept busy in Paris throughout the German occupation. There was official disapproval of his work, but a ready underground market for it. Another of Paris's modern masters, Georges Braque, also branded a degenerate, painted away unmolested. In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler turned east to deal with the Soviet Union. The invasion of Russia was intended to be the last of his so-called lightning wars. In scorching heat, the German army drove deep into the heart of Russia. Like the Poles, the Slavic Russians were considered little better than subhuman. Atrocities were committed not only by the SS, but also by regular army units. The panzers rolled on. Tolstoy's house, Yasnaya Polyana, was ransacked, as were museums honoring Chekhov, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Tchaikovsky, whose home was turned into a garage. Behind the frontline troops came squads of SS archaeologists, members of the Ahnenerbe, scouring the Ukraine for long-lost Teutonic civilizations. By the late summer of 1941, the Germans had thrust deep into European Russia. Kharkov was menaced from north and south, as was Smolensk in the center, while in the north, Leningrad was also threatened by the speed of the German advance. By November 1941, Leningrad had come under a siege which was to last almost 900 days. The city could have been stormed at the beginning of September, but Hitler ordered it to be cut off and its citizens starved to death. By the time the siege was lifted by the Red Army in January 1944, some 1.5 million of Leningrad citizens had died. Leningrad had been isolated from north and south, by the Germans in the south and to the north by their Finnish allies. After the Germans had seized the railhead at Tikhvin, the Russians drove a supply route to Leningrad through dense forests and over the frozen Lake Ladoga. The Russians retook Tikhvin, but the ice road remained Leningrad's winter lifeline. The pride of Leningrad was the Hermitage Museum. By the end of August 1941, nearly 1 million of the Hermitage's art objects had been carried by train east of the Urals. Then the rescue route was cut by the Germans. While shells rained down on the roof of the Hermitage, the rest of its collection was moved to the vast bomb-proof cellars, which also accommodated over 2,000 people. Mildew was the greatest enemy here. Only the Hermitage's well-preserved Egyptian mummies proved resistant. While the people of Leningrad clung on, Hitler shuttled back and forth between his headquarters in East Prussia and a forward base in the Ukraine. At his headquarters, and in the skies over the steppes, he daydreamed of a conquered Western Russia. The Ukraine and Crimea would be populated by German farmers. A network of autobahns and high-speed trains would link this bastion of Greater Germany to the heartland of the Reich. But Hitler's dreams were never realized. At Stalingrad, an entire German army was cut off and forced to surrender. February 1943 marked the turn of the tide on the Eastern Front. The red flag now flew over Stalingrad. 100,000 men of the German 6th Army marched into a captivity from which few would return. Five months later, at the Battle of Kursk, Hitler's panzers were stopped in their tracks by the Red Army. The German defeat at Kursk marked a watershed on the Eastern Front. Thereafter, the story was one of Russian advance and German retreat. The United States had entered the war in December 1941. Within a year, plans had been drawn up for the Allied invasion of Northwest Africa as a preliminary to the invasion of Europe. Simultaneously, American art historians were liaising with their British counterparts on the safeguarding of monuments which lay in the path of Allied armies. With the backing of President Roosevelt, they were also preparing for the recovery and return of the treasures looted by the Germans. At the beginning of November 1942, an Anglo-American task force was concentrating for Operation Torch, the invasion of the Vichy French colonies of Morocco and Algeria. The operation would be a baptism of fire not only for the American troops, but also for the so-called American and British monuments men accompanying them. But the latter would not have an easy ride. Allied commanders were opposed to monuments officers serving in frontline units. They rejected proposals that the monuments teams in North Africa be accompanied by civilian experts. The ruins of Carthage, in which Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed British troops, were spared from destruction, but many problems lay ahead for the Allied monuments men. Mainland Italy, crammed from top to toe with some of the most famous buildings and artworks in the world, presented the monuments men with their most serious headache. Would it be possible to protect them if the Germans fought the Allies every inch of the way up the Italian peninsula? Italy capitulated on the 3rd of September 1943, only days before the Allies crossed from Sicily to the mainland. As the Allies anticipated, the Germans rushed in troops to fill the military vacuum. The struggle for Italy would be long and hard. On the 1st of October 1943, the Allies entered the city of Naples. Before they withdrew, the Germans had committed countless acts of vandalism, including the burning of the university library. By the beginning of 1944, the Allies had clawed their way northwards, up the Italian peninsula, to the formidable defensive barrier of the German Gustav Line. Rome still seemed a distant prize. The linchpin of the Gustav Line was the massive monastery at Monte Cassino, which dominated the route to the Italian capital. After the failure of several assaults on the Cassino position, the decision was taken to bomb the monastery. Monte Cassino had originally housed a massive store of Italian art treasures, but in October 1943, these had been removed on the orders of the local German commander. Allied bombs and artillery reduced the monastery to a mountainous heap of rubble. At the outset, it had not been defended by German troops. Now it became a perfect defensive position. German paratroops clung on to Monte Cassino until the end of May 1944. On the 4th of June 1944, the US Fifth Army entered Rome. One of the Allied monuments officers, sent forward to assess the damage to the Eternal City, had entered Rome ahead of the combat troops. Rome had been declared an open city, and the German occupiers, now retreating northward, had refrained from widespread looting. But Florence was not spared. Allied bombing had ended the evacuation of the city's art treasures, and by the beginning of August, the Allies were on the southern outskirts of the city. The fighting was fierce. Florence had not been declared an open city, and the battle raged for nearly a month before the Germans withdrew. They had blown the bridges in central Florence, including the Santa Trinita, said to have been designed by Michelangelo. Only the Ponte Vecchio survived, surrounded by mines. Soon the fighting moved on to threaten other famous buildings. As winter mud brought operations in Italy to a standstill, the monuments officers fretted about the location of the treasures taken from Florence by the Germans. They accused the Germans of looting. The Germans replied that what they had removed was safe. In the early summer of 1944, the small towns and ports of southern England had been taken over by the massive force assembled by the Allies for the invasion of France, codenamed Operation Overlord. Confidence ran high. In London, the role of the monuments officers attached to the Allied armies was overshadowed by the sheer scale of Overlord. Eventually, the work of the American monuments officers was to be supplemented by men from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. This US agency had been formed in 1942 to gather intelligence and support resistance movements in occupied Europe. The notion of investigating Nazi looting appealed to the OSS, whose London office was headed by art historian David Bruce. On D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, 2 days after the Allies had entered Rome, Operation Overlord was launched. The liberation of France had begun. But it was a week before the first monuments officer, the New York architect Bancel Lafarge, came ashore. Lafarge quickly discovered that the Bayeux tapestry had been removed to safety. But as the Allied bridgehead expanded, the monuments officers were mere bystanders as bombing and ground fighting consumed the ancient towns of Normandy. Allied fighter bombers were now enjoying free rein over northern France. The monuments men knew that the Germans were evacuating art treasures by train and entertained mounting fears that priceless paintings would be shredded by the cannon of marauding thunderbolts. With the war clearly lost, the Germans had embarked on one last frenzy of looting. So-called M-Action teams had been in action, stripping bourgeois homes of their contents. This booty was to join thousands of church bells stolen from every corner of Europe. In France, the most important art repositories were now dotted around the Dordogne, far from the heaviest fighting. To the north, on the Normandy coast, one medieval marvel which had escaped serious damage was Mont Saint-Michel. It provided a brief haven for Ernest Hemingway, then a war correspondent. In August 1944, after the breakout from the Normandy bridgehead, the race was on to liberate Paris. Ignoring Hitler's orders to leave the city a field of ruins, the German commander in Paris, General von Choltitz, declared it an open city. On the 25th of August, American and Free French troops entered the French capital. The Champagne days were over for captured German officers. The Louvre and the Jeu de Paume had been caught in the fighting which had flared between the resistance and the departing Germans. But the city had survived unscathed. Food and fuel were short as autumn approached, but the heart of the city scarcely missed a beat. Paris and the Parisians provided the Allies with their own traditional welcome. The art market had boomed under the acquisitive Germans. A renewed boom was sparked off by the liberation. Painters populated Montmartre, and the open-air galleries and bookstalls on Paris's left bank plied a roaring trade. Ernest Hemingway arrived at Pablo Picasso's studio to present the artist with a box of grenades, a surrealist gift which Picasso failed to appreciate. The German ambassador, Otto Abetz, who had oiled the wheels for the German exploitation of France's art market and its collections of masterpieces, was eventually to face trial. Many of the dealers who had profited from the German occupation, particularly in the trade in degenerate art, had slipped away before the Allies could apprehend them. Abetz was not so lucky. The Allied armored columns now swung east towards the German border. The war was being carried back to the tottering 1,000-year Reich. The first German city to fall to the Allies in October 1944 was Aachen, the capital of Charlemagne. There was heavy fighting for the ancient town and much destruction, but no choice could be made between sacrificing Allied troops and saving historic buildings. The buildings had to go. But Aachen's great 10th century cathedral remained almost intact. Raged in the streets, while in his bunker near the Reichschancellery, Hitler spent hours gazing at a model of the unbuilt museum in Linz, in which he planned to house his looted art treasures when the war was over. But Hitler and his dreams died in the flames of Berlin. At the end of April, the Allies reached Neuschwanstein, where they found many of the looted French art treasures whose destination had been noted by Rose Valland. GIs posed for the camera with 18th century aristocrats. Simultaneously, American and Soviet troops made contact at Torgau on the River Elbe. The end of the war was in sight. The roads of Europe were clogged with refugees, making their way back home. Another refugee of a kind was Hermann Goering, who had been captured by the Americans. Deprived of the morphine to which he was addicted, Goering confessed that much of his looted treasure was now stored on a train at Berchtesgaden, Hitler's retreat in Bavaria. The Reichsführer had no need of it now. Berchtesgaden lay south of Munich, on the border with Austria. The great picture window from which Hitler had once gazed had been blown out by Allied bombers. Allied monuments men found Goering's train. And began to unload the contents. More than 1,000 items were eventually removed from the train and stored in the few buildings at Berchtesgaden which had escaped destruction by Allied bombs. Up the hill came a painting by Rubens, once owned by Cardinal Richelieu, and dozens of priceless masterpieces. The US 101st Airborne Division staged an impromptu exhibition, but at least one of Goering's prized possessions, a Vermeer, turned out to be a fake. The stunned population of a ruined Germany had little time to spare for Goering's misfortune. Everywhere the fighting had ripped up familiar landmarks. Berlin's exclusive Adlon Hotel was now a billet for Red Army privates. In August, the Big Three, Churchill, Truman and Stalin, met at Potsdam, outside Berlin. They were more concerned with the division of Central and Eastern Europe than the millions of looted works of art now stored in a devastated Germany. Nevertheless, the British and Americans thrashed out a framework for coping with the massive tasks of cataloguing, restoration and restitution, which now faced their art experts. The Western Allies also faced the grim task of sifting through mountains of Nazi plunder, most of which could never be returned. General Lucius Clay served under Eisenhower as the deputy military governor of the US zone of occupation in Germany. Clay was responsible for the execution of policy over Nazi plunder now in American hands. A start was made. The stained glass windows from Strasbourg Cathedral were retrieved and sent home. Their reinstallation seemed symbolic of the surge of hope which swept across a shattered Europe after the war. There was a once-in-a-lifetime exhibition in Germany itself, at Wiesbaden. Rembrandts and a priceless bust of the Egyptian princess Nefertiti jostled for attention. In Florence, the trumpets rang out for the return of the treasures removed from the Uffizi by the Germans and restored by the US Fifth Army. Fifth Army, represented by General Edgar E. Hume, ensured that the operation was staged in style. The priceless shipment, listed simply on the dispatch manifest as art treasures, was valued at $500 million. At last, the war seemed over. The job of the monuments officers in Italy was also over. Within weeks, their role was assumed by the Italians. But in the immediate aftermath of the battle for Italy, they had represented a beacon of decent and civilized values in a world laid waste by the Nazis. However, for some Allied troops, the lure of rich pickings had proved too strong. American Colonel Jack Durant, a serving officer with the occupying forces, was arrested with his wife in a Chicago hotel and charged with the theft of jewels from the home of the Duke of Hesse. The jewels were recovered from an Illinois railway station locker. Their value is estimated at $1.5 million. Durant and his wife, another serving officer, were flown back to Germany to stand trial. So much had been recovered, and so much had been lost. This Raphael portrait of a gentleman was taken to Germany by Hans Frank, and to this day remains missing. The Tsar's famous amber room, stolen from Russia by the Germans in 1941, has never been recovered. The hunt for the room's priceless amber panels has never ceased. Some say that at the end of the war, the panels were hidden by the SS in a silver mine south of Berlin. Others claim that the panels were buried on the shores of the Baltic near the city of Königsberg, the last place where they were seen. The spot now lies under a lagoon, which may cover what was once described as the eighth wonder of the world. In the aftermath of the war, US President Truman sparked controversy by agreeing to the removal to the United States for exhibition of 202 German works of art. They finally went on display at Washington's National Gallery early in 1948. Some of the monuments men accused the US government of being little better than the Nazis. But at the end of a nationwide tour, the exhibition had been seen by millions of Americans and raised large sums for German children, many of whom wrote moving thank you notes to the various participating institutions. Starting with the most fragile items, all of the 202 were eventually returned to Germany. In contrast, the Russians, who suffered so terribly at German hands during the war, have never felt any compunction about retaining the works of art they liberated in 1945. In 1995, the Hermitage Museum mounted an exhibition of these works, including paintings by Gauguin and Renoir. But many Jewish families still await the restitution of the possessions they lost in the dark days of the war. The proceeds of this recent art auction in Vienna went to victims of the Holocaust. But is this a case of too little, too late for many of the victims of the greatest crime and the greatest art theft of the century? History will be the judge.
Bizarre rituals, body snatchers and graves full to overflowing. Dan Cruikshank investigates the Victorian way of death on UK TV History next. And Sky Digital viewers, you can now do a keyword search on your TV. Just press the red button followed by the yellow one.